Hey Optimancers, Chris here. A viewer asked if you have Booming Blade, do you need extra attack? And if you have both, which one should you use? Obviously, if you're playing a ranged character, you can't use Booming Blade, but what if you're a melee character? Let's discuss it. If you'd be interested in supporting this channel, you can do so through Patreon. There is a link in the video description. Today I'd like to thank some top-level patrons: Sam S., Scott Dunnington, Scott Shields, Sig, Stephen Edmondson, Stephen Yates, Steve Bouvel, TUM, Tazel, Thomas Barrero, TomTom, Tristan Bello, Vu, Wesley Terpstra, Wick, Zachary Shapiro, Xandar the Mighty, Mark D, Taft Taj, Tyler WS, and Vo. Thank you all so much for your support. Let's get started. Now before we get started, I should mention, if you are a Blade Singer, you can do Booming Blade as part of your extra attack. So you don't have to choose between them, you can do them both. However, if you're a Swords Bard, a Paladin, a Ranger, a Fighter, or even a Barbarian, as long as you're not raging, and you have extra attack and Booming Blade, you might have to choose which one you want to use. Then there's the special case of the Eldritch Knight, where if we use a Booming Blade with our action, we could make a weapon attack with our bonus action as of 7th level using War Magic. So which one do we use? Let's look at Booming Blade first and really break down what it does for us. So here's Booming Blade, cantrip, one action. It's easy to get. There's lots of ways to get Booming Blade on your character. You brandish the weapon used in the spell's casting and make a melee attack with it against a creature within 5 feet of you. On a hit, the target suffers the weapon attack's normal effects, and then becomes sheathed in booming energy until the start of your next turn. If the target willingly moves 5 feet or more before then, the target takes 1d8 thunder damage, and the spell ends. The spell's damage increases when you reach certain levels. At 5th level, the melee attack deals an extra 1d8 thunder damage to a target on a hit, and the damage that the target takes from moving increases to 2d8. Both damage rolls increase by 1d8 at 11th level, and again at 17th level. So the first question we need to answer to know what this provides us is, how often are we going to see that damage from the target moving? And I should stress willingly moving. So if the target is not willingly moving, then they do not take the damage even if they move. I'm going to refer to this damage as the secondary damage, and the automatic damage as part of the weapon attack as the primary damage. Now, from levels 1 through 4, this spell is not doing any primary damage, only secondary damage. But you know what? From levels 1 to 4, we definitely don't have extra attack, so we're not comparing these options yet anyways. In damage calculations on builds for secondary damage, I've always used 50%. As in, I figure it's about a 50-50 chance whether you get the secondary damage or not. I have to say, with lots more experience, I think that number is probably a bit optimistic. There are certain cases where we get it almost all the time. So, like if we're using Warcaster to make an opportunity attack against a creature leaving our reach, well, it's the movement that's provoking the opportunity attack. So unless the creature stops moving immediately after getting hit, which honestly makes their provoking the attack in the first place pretty pointless, then they're taking the damage. So in that one case, we're almost certainly getting the secondary damage. But we're not getting extra attack with opportunity attacks, so in the case of the question as to which one we should use, it's not really relevant. When we use our action on our turn to cast Booming Blade, I find the times that secondary damage comes up is far less likely. If I'm up next to a creature and I attack it with Booming Blade, there's a pretty good chance it's just going to attack me back on its turn, so it doesn't really need to move. Even if I back away through the mobility feat, or Rabbit Hop, or Cunning Action, or Misty Step, or any of the other ways to get safely out of melee, if there's an ally in reach of that enemy, they can just attack them. Again, they don't need to move. If we attack an enemy with an ally not near them, and then back away, if they have a ranged attack or spellcasting options, they can use those. Again, they don't need to move. If they can teleport, especially with a bonus action, then they can also choose to do that, which doesn't provoke the secondary damage from Booming Blade because they're not using their movement. And that brings up something I get asked all the time as well. No, if a creature teleports, it doesn't cause a secondary damage. If a creature is moved, rather than using its own movement, it doesn't get the secondary damage either. It needs to move using its own movement willingly. So even if we force a creature to use its own movement with something like a command spell or a dissonant whisper spell, that does trigger opportunity attacks, because opportunity attacks only require that the target move, but it does not trigger booming blade damage, because booming blade damage also specifies that movement has to be willing. But you know what? If they don't have ranged options, they don't have spell options, they don't have teleport options, and you have left them with no attack options, then you know what? There's a really good chance you're going to get that secondary damage. There's other reasons why they might trigger that damage as well. Maybe they're wanting to attack different party members than the ones they're in melee with or in reach of, and that would require movement. Maybe they're trying to move out of a spell effect. That would require movement. So there are tactical ways we can make it more inviting for that creature to trigger that secondary damage. But like I said, in my experience, Booming Blade causes the secondary damage less than half the time. But there are tactical things we can do to make it more likely. So for the comparison I'm going to do today, I'm going to stick with the 50%, but just keep in mind that your results may vary. And also keep in mind that I discussed some of the things that might provoke a creature to take that secondary damage. We can often predict those at our table. So if you are choosing between extra attack or Booming Blade, just think about how likely that secondary damage is to occur, because that likelihood could alter the decision. So the earliest anybody will get extra attack is level 5. Conveniently, this is when Booming Blade scales. So Booming Blade is now adding a d8 to the attack, which I call the primary Booming Blade damage, and that's 4.5 points of damage on average. Then they would add 2d8 if they get the secondary damage, and if we assume that happens 50% of the time, that's another 4.5 on average. So basically, 9 extra damage if we hit with our main attack. If we score a critical hit, which is normally about 5% of the time, we double the primary damage but not the secondary damage. That works out to another 0.23 damage. So I guess we're really adding about 9.23 to the main attack if it hits. Extra attack damage depends on our weapon and our ability score we're using for the attack. So let's start with a D8 weapon. Lots of D8 weapons in the game. Most of them we're talking one-handed. And then let's say we have a +3 modifier in our primary ability score, so like a 16. So that would be 4.5 weapon damage plus 3 ability score damage, or 7.5 damage for that extra attack. Criticals also add 0.23 here, so 7.73. So 9.23 versus 7.73. So in this case, Booming Blade comes out ahead. I won't worry about the chance to hit here, because we can assume the chances to hit are about the same. So is Booming Blade the better option? Well, there's a lot of other factors I haven't put in yet. Let's say, for example, you're a paladin and Smite is an option. Well, with Booming Blade you could add it once. With extra attack, you could potentially add it twice. That would lead to an extra 9 damage. Heavy resource cost though for that. Let's say you had the Hex spell up, or a Hunter's Mark. That's another 3.5 damage from extra attack. Once again, extra attack comes out ahead. And if we don't get that secondary damage, then extra attack is coming out ahead yet again. But there's more factors to consider. Let's say you have the option of 2-weapon fighting, or using a Polearm Master bonus action attack, or any other method of attacking again that requires you to use the attack action, and there's a number of them. Well, those do add to extra attack, but they don't work with Booming Blade, because casting Booming Blade doesn't count as taking the attack action, except as I previously noted with the Blade Singer's extra attack option. What if you're using a bigger weapon, like a greatsword or a maul? Well, then the damage from the extra attack becomes 10.35 on average, again ahead of Booming Blade. Then there's the case of Great Weapon Master. If you're using the -5 plus 10 option, then the extra damage of that extra attack becomes much bigger. And what if the ability score we're using for attacks is higher than a +3 modifier? Well, then that adds to extra attack damage, but not to Booming Blade damage. We should also talk about reach, because if using reach weapons is a tactical advantage, that's something you can't do with Booming Blade. And then we have to talk about magic weapons, because if we have a magic weapon that adds to damage of our attacks, again, that adds to our extra attacks damage, but not our Booming Blade damage. Speaking of magic weapons, thunder damage is fairly reliable, but magic weapon damage is even more reliable. There's going to be more cases where the monsters you're fighting are resistant or immune to thunder damage than are resistant or immune to your magical weapons damage, regardless of whether that damage is piercing, slashing, or bludgeoning. So there's so many cases that make extra attack better than Booming Blade here. Here's where Booming Blade is better at 5th level. When our weapon damage is poor. When we don't have a magic weapon that adds the damage. When we don't have bonus action options that require us to take the attack action. When we have a reasonable chance of getting that secondary damage. And we're not adding weapon damage from other sources like Hunter's Mark or Great Weapon Master or anything that can add damage to every attack. If all of those things are true, then Booming Blade is better. Otherwise, we're probably better with extra attack, at least at level 5. Now let's talk about the Eldritch Knight at level 7. Here's the thing. If you don't have something good to do with your bonus action other than War Magic, then Booming Blade plus a weapon attack is always going to be better than 2 plain weapon attacks. However, if you have a bonus action attack through Polearm Master, for example, then the comparison actually doesn't change that much, because you're getting a bonus action attack either way. The Polearm Master bonus action attack does a bit less damage, but it honestly isn't a huge difference. But let's look at level 11, because things do change here. Now, if we're a fighter, our extra attack is scaled at this point, so we're going to get 3 attacks with our attack action. So in that case, yeah, extra attack is probably the way to go. But let's say we're not an 11th level fighter. Then our extra attack isn't scaling anymore, and never will. But our Booming Blade has scaled at level 11, and it is going to scale again. So basically, we've got 2d8 primary damage, 9 on average, 3d8 secondary damage, that's 13.5 on average, then say that's 50% of the time, so down to 6.75. Then our primary damage doubles on a critical, so that's now 9 times 5%, or 0.45. Means our total extra damage from Booming Blade on our attack is now up to 16.2 points of damage. So that's the number extra attack needs to match, 15.75. Now, if we're using Great Weapon Master, that is super easy. With weapon damage plus ability score plus 10, we're already over that number. What about Polearm Master? Well, the weapon is a big factor here. First off, we're level 11. Is our weapon magical? I would say in most cases it would be magical by level 11, but you know what? We can't say that for sure. So let's start out with no magical bonus to damage. And frankly, let's start out with low weapon damage too. So we'll say we're using a quarterstaff. So we'd be talking about a d6 weapon damage, 3.5 on average. Now, we could ask what our primary ability score is going to be at level 11. I'd say there's a good chance we've increased it, but let's say we haven't. So then we'd be talking plus 3. Bonus action attack, we add another 2.5 on average, plus 3 again from our ability scores, another 5.5. Then there's crits, another 0.3. We end up with 13.3, which is definitely less than Booming Blade. But let's just consider if we optimize even a little bit. Let's take the duelist fighting style. Well, in both cases, the main weapon attack gets the plus 2. But here, with our extra attack and our bonus action attack, we're adding another 4. So now we've taken that 13.3, now we're at 17.3. And now we're out-damaging Booming Blade. This is just a quarterstaff, with a 16 primary ability score modifier, a non-magic weapon, and 1 fighting style. What if we don't have Polearm Master? So we're using a longsword. And then we would have no bonus action attack. Well, the extra attack is 7.5. Then let's say dueling for 9.5. Now our bonus action is free here. So let's say we throw a Hunter's Mark on there. Well, now we're at 13. Now let's say we have a plus 2 weapon. So now it's 15. We're still not at Booming Blade damage, but it is close. And none of those things I added are really unreasonable for the level. Now, if we're thinking that secondary damage is 50% chance likely to occur or higher, then Booming Blade is better. But you know what? If we think it's lower than 50%, with the modifiers I talked about, the longsword is actually still probably the better bet. Soon as we get into two-handed weapons, though, extra attack is more likely to be better. What about our Eldritch Knight, though? Well, with 3 attacks on an attack action, with a scaled extra attack, War Magic probably isn't enough, even though we don't have a bonus action option. Okay, so extra attack is probably still better than Booming Blade at level 11, unless we're really not focusing on weapon damage. But what about level 17? So at this time, Booming Blade scales again. An extra attack, let's say we still only have 2 attacks. By now, is Booming Blade the obvious play? So this is the most Booming Blade is ever going to add to a weapon attack. 3d8 primary damage, 13.5 on average, 4d8 secondary damage, which is 18 on average. If we assume that's 50% of the time, that's 9. And then on a crit, we'll do an extra 0.68. So our total extra damage from Booming Blade on our 17th level character is 23.18. That's the number to beat. Now, if we are 17th level, and we are going into melee, and we are making attacks, and we're using a longsword, and we have a 16 strength and a +1 weapon, we're not talking about optimization at all, right? Optimization isn't on the table at this point. We are just playing in a completely, utterly non-optimized group. In that case, Booming Blade might be the better option. But let's say we are playing with people who have at least a basic understanding of optimization. So we have 22.5 extra damage from Booming Blade. What can we do with simple optimization? Well, we could get our primary ability score to 20. I mean, maybe higher, but let's say 20. Let's say we're using a glaive. We'll say +2. I mean, it might be +3 by 17th level. Heck, it might even add dice of extra damage. But let's be modest and say +2. Polar Master, Great Weapon Master, they're both going to be in play. So we have 5.5 base weapon damage, +5 ability score damage, +2 magic weapon damage, +10 Great Weapon Master damage. That's 22.5 on our extra attack. Add a tiny bit more for criticals, and we got 22.78. That's just about what we were doing with our Booming Blade extra damage. And we haven't made our bonus action attack yet. If we make our bonus action attack, we're almost doubling the extra damage that we would have gotten from Booming Blade. So we're going to come close to doubling that amount. And we're not even looking at the other ways we might add to damage at this level. And there are a lot of ways that might occur. So I guess the way I want to answer the initial question is, there are some cases where Booming Blade is going to be better than extra attack. But if we want to optimize a melee character, we're usually better off using our extra attack feature. And if we're well optimized, we're normally going to be way better off. I don't want to downplay Booming Blade because it does have its uses. As a Warcaster opportunity attack, it's great. As part of a Bladesinger's extra attack, it's great. I often use it as a bridge. If I'm multi-classing a character and I'm not going to get my extra attack at level 5, then Booming Blade is better than a single weapon attack. There are definitely places where Booming Blade is the correct move. But Booming Blade just isn't a replacement for extra attack. If you don't have extra attack, it is better than nothing. But if you do and you want to optimize melee weapon attacks, that's what you want to build around. So I hope I answered your question. And until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.